my name is Bowman, and I'm a senior in the economics department here at Smith. And for my time in the con, I really wanted to focus on the interaction between student debt and memory. And as I sat through these colloquiums, I became more convinced of the ways in which debt is a very powerful tool of memory. So your basic dictionary definition of memory is the power or process of reproducing or recalling what has been learned or retained, especially through associative mechanisms. So it is a way of taking the past into the present and bringing the present into the future through involuntary or voluntary means. And like I said, I very much see debt as falling into this. So first and foremost, debt is an objective record. A debt is a contract between two parties, right? Let's say I want to buy a house. I'm going to get all of these mortgage documents or lien documents and all of the documents associated with that process, and they're going to serve as an objective record of that debt. And it reflects my individual choice and my situation, right? I'm in a place where I'd like to buy a house, and I can buy a house. And if I look at all of my debts throughout my life, I can kind of see a timeline of all of the choices I've made. That being said, this is deeply situated in a social and economic context, number 3, in the fact that debt, more so than other forms of memory, is very demonstrative of the ways in which social and economic forces are at play. And so going back to our mortgage example, this is really evident in the 2008 financial crisis. So we have the economic crisis, which is the economic context, a housing bubble burst because of a lot of subprime mortgages. And then we have the social context. White people are much more likely to keep their homes than black people because we live in a deeply racist society. And because of this, we create this very deep and powerful collective memory. And that's what's really interesting to me, because it's so emotional at an individual level and at a social level and a larger level, and it can show us where we have been in history and where we're going. And I think that the collective memory of student debt is going to continue to impact academia and our generation for a really long time. So on the emotional side of things, if everyone feels comfortable, I'd like you to close your eyes and visualize your money. Whatever that looks like to you, whether that's physical currency or a hill, negative space because perhaps you have debt. Visualize your money and then notice how you feel. Is there any emotions that come up with that? Open your eyes. So I did this exercise with the professors and some of the students of the con when I presented about a month ago, just on the more economic side of student debt. And it was a very powerful exercise. There were really powerful stories that came with the association of currency. Like one of the professors talked about the first time he came to the United States. But what most resonated with me was what one of my fellow students said, because it was what I said as well, which is a little narcissistic, recognize that. And that was anxiety. She felt anxiety. And I also feel anxiety. I know that a lot of people feel anxious in thinking about their finances and their debt, but I think that's exacerbated for students. I have a friend who's 19 years old. She's not of legal drinking age yet, and she has $90,000 of debt in her name alone. That anxiety is crushing her. She doesn't sleep. She's going into investment banking because she thinks it's the fastest way to make money, although she's not very happy with what she's going into. She is physically and emotionally being crushed under the weight of that debt and that anxiety. So thinking about that drove me to ask this question in terms of memory. Does the financial anxiety that's associated with student debt create actual blocks in encoding and retrieving episodic memory? Essentially, I asked, are we so anxious because of our student debt, and this would apply to other financial situations, that we're physically not recording these memories in our brains accurately? And this is an important question to ask because it has huge implications for the way in which we understand financial management and financial literacy, and the ways in which we interact as a society around savings, retirement, spending, debt, etc. So obviously this is a psychology question, and I'm an economics student, so I had a very big learning gap, and definitely used a lot of resources. MJ Raga in the psych department here and Becky Spencer in the psych department at UMass gave me a huge amount of help. And I moved forward in this question, but before I did, I asked, can I answer this question? Am I capable of answering this question? Like, I don't have a psych background, this is going to be tough. And I decided I wanted to try because, like I said, this is a really important question, and as a student with a lot of student debt, as a student with a lot of friends who have a lot of student debt, I think this is really important to ask. So I structured a psychology experiment. I'm not going to go into it, but this is essentially the layout. And what you should know is that hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of my time went into figuring this out. And hours of other people's time as well, as Rosetta can tell you. I got through IRB, I got funding, I had IRB. I had funding, I had everything planned out to the 5-second intervals to my food, and it was 5 days before I was supposed to do this, and I canceled it. And the reason I canceled it was because the whole time I was structuring this, I had this little uncomfortable bug in the back of my brain that I kind of just ignored. I was like, oh, I'm uncomfortable because I don't notice what's going on. Feel that way all the time in my econ classes. But ultimately, I realized I had been asking if I could do this research. Am I capable of this? But I didn't ask if I should do this research. And to me, conducting a psychology experiment without any psychology background and without a psychology professor overseeing my work was inherently unethical. And I didn't feel like I could open up these wounds of vulnerability in my peers around their student loans without that background. And this ultimately was my failure. It was abrupt and it was a little dramatic. It made me feel a little sad on the inside. But it was a failure. But I'm glad that I stopped because ultimately I had to ask that ethical question before moving forward. And it reflects how complex this issue is. So when I was a freshman at University of Denver, I transferred here, I got into school and I remember actually thinking to myself, everything in academia has been discovered. We know truth about everything. I was like, we're not going to learn anything. I'm not going to discover anything new. I'm going into politics. And it shows how little I knew about both politics and academia. And this limited understanding in all realms of academia is especially reflective in student debt and in memory. In fact, we knew very little about the portfolio of student debt until about 2013 and 2014, which is, I mean, it's pretty crazy to imagine that we had a $12 trillion portfolio of assets that we knew very little about. That's frightening. And memory is similarly undiscovered. It's a really growing and exciting and fun field, and it's so fun to participate in the con, but it's really limited. And because of this limited information and my limited background, I didn't feel okay moving forward with this experiment. But this prompted me to ask the question to myself, who is allowed to ask these questions? As an economics major, am I allowed to question the psychology discipline? And if I ask these questions and nobody ever pursues them, if I ask, is memory impacted by financial anxiety, and no one ever researches this, does it even matter that I ask the question? And more importantly, it drove me to ask, who is allowed to answer these questions? And who do we listen to? How do we establish these systems of credibility around academia that creates both an inclusive but also diverse system of thought? And I very much see the way in which my psych experiment failed as reflective of the systems of power that are in place in academia. That being said, for example, an analogy, I'm an economics major. I would never want an economics major to ask me medical questions to try to diagnose me. But I also recognize that people who are in the situation to ask medical questions probably come from a different set of privileges than many people in our society. So I actually genuinely do pose this question. And I think that in an academic environment, especially for professors in the room, it's important to ask how we distribute this information and what we pay attention to, what we teach in our classes, in order to be as diverse and challenging in an academic environment as possible. So with that, I end my presentation and move on. If I can, there we go.